let's start and welcome everyone to our second office hours for the course, What is Contemporary Art? My name is Sean Anderson. I'm an associate curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA, and it is my and our great pleasure to say hi to everyone around the world today and to introduce, for those of you who were not able to join us the last time, to our informal hour-long conversation, which is open-ended, and it in many ways tries to extend the conversations that begin in many of the forums that we have developed with our amazing educators in the course. And so this office hours will be concluded at 1 hour. And what we ask you each to do is, if you're going to ask a question in chat, is to introduce yourselves, tell us where you're joining us from. And you can, throughout the session, post your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. On occasion, we try to group some of the questions that may or may not be similar with each other. And we will also be covering a number of the questions that have been kindly submitted to us in advance in the course and by email, of course. Before we have any more housekeeping, I think it's important just to say that we are incredibly grateful to all of you for joining us. We hope that you and your families and friends and colleagues around the world are as safe and healthy as possible.
Thanks, Sean. I'm Sophie Cavoulacos. I'm an assistant curator in the Department of Film. One of the educators, one of the instructors, curators put together this course. And just echoing Sean's well wishes to all of you, and to extend our really warm greetings to be able to see so many engaged learners in this digital classroom, digital office hours. So welcome back to those returning to this format, and welcome to all of you joining us for the first time. Just a few housekeeping notes. For the best experience on your end, we recommend joining this webinar via the Zoom desktop app. Hopefully a lot of you are doing that already. You can download that at zoom.us. That's smoother than accessing us through your browser, I am told. Many MoMA colleagues are present today. It takes a big team to make this kind of event happen successfully. You'll see our education colleagues responding in the chat and engaging with all of you. We are so grateful to educators Sarah, Kelly, Letty, Hannah, and Eleni, and to our technicians Hunter, Mike, and Sarah for their expert organization of this program. And you'll see in the upper left corner, we are recording this session. So you are on camera. Again, we're just so excited to see so many of you from around the world, and really appreciate your questions, curiosity, engagement. And we have a lot to get to, so let's get started.
Hi, my name is Arièle Dionne-Krosnick. I am a curatorial assistant in the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA, and I was part of the team working on this course. I'm so happy to see you all here for our second office hours, and I'll start by reading a question that we got in advance, and we'll get started with some answers. So this is a question from Laura Alvarez, who is asking us a question about authorship, and she says, Damien Hirst's spot paintings were mostly made by his assistants, but in no way are they regarded as even co-authors. So does the artist have to create the idea and execute it, or would they just create it? And what role do the people who execute the work, so that idea, what is their role in contemporary art? So, you know, that's one of the huge questions in art, and it has been for a long time. And that's a question that comes up in many media as well. I mean, in literature as well, with the role of the author, the artist. So for many years for a lot of art history, we have tended to only acknowledge one single artist, and to really elevate this idea of a creative person alone creating this masterpiece. And I think as we come into contemporary art, and really even before that, you start to see and learn that artists, they don't work in a vacuum, and they're often helped by incredible staffs of studio assistants, studio managers. A lot of artists who've become very, very famous and have works exhibited worldwide employ huge studios. Damien Hirst was mentioned in the questions, but also thinking of artists like Takashi Murakami. And, they choose whether they're going to acknowledge the role of other hands in their work. As far as I'm concerned, that does not mean that, they are not an artist because someone else executes the work, but that's really an ethical question that every artist has to grapple with. What we start to see as well is artists who start to be intentionally more exclusive of either their collaborators, or in performance, you see this a lot, that they're going to name and not only bring attention to an issue, but also to really include people as full collaborators. So some examples that I really like, and one of these is in the course, is the Revital Cohen and Ter van Balen work 75 Watts. So that's the work kind of looking at the energy that it takes for a human being to create a light bulb, and that's 75 watts. And it's really kind of this performance, this dance created with the factory workers themselves. So you see them in the work, it brings attention to these labor issues, but the workers are also the participants in the work. One other great example, and one of my favorite artists, is Mirla Laderman-Ukules, who instituted this maintenance art. She really wanted to bring attention to sanitation workers in New York, to all this invisible work that happens. She has these great pieces, for example, doing ballets with heavy machinery, but she, the dances of these heavy machinery, like snowplows, for example, they were really developed in collaboration, in celebration of the work of these people who are often invisible. So that's how I interpret the question, but I know that Sophie and Sean have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, no, it's such a great way to start. I mean, thinking of foregrounding the kind of labor, the kind of ethics, and also the kind of collaboration that's at the core of so much of the most vibrant art, but culture of all kinds. I mean, I think the role of collectivity, of doing things together, actually could be a whole other course. What's the kind of process of joining, different creative practices. But I had a bit of a different interpretation, different reaction to this question, which is to think of artists. So you think of an instance of an artist who's not using their hands, right, their own hands, to create something. And I just wanted to respond to something in the chat that definitely has a precursor, absolute precursor in the work of the 60s and 70s. It's kind of this kind of de-skilled or conceptual approach, whether it's art that is made of instructions for somebody else to perform, whether it's art that's sent through the mail. That's one of my favorite kind of topics, the idea of especially right now, right, we're at home, of mail art, correspondence art being a way that we're connected. But in terms of the question, it really was thinking about, what is an artist other than a maker? Well, an artist can be a collector, an artist can be an archivist, an artist in some ways can be a detective, right? Seeking out objects, found objects that then form the basis of their work. There was a sensational, a really moving show at the New Museum a few years ago called The Keeper. Maybe we can link to another organization that we love in the chat. You can look at some of those works that really revolved around artists as collectors. What are the objects that artists, contemporary artists, living artists, seek out and create work from, instead of creating it with their own hands? And then I would point to our collection and the course, two very different works that engage with this idea in a really powerful way. One is Arthur Jafa's Apex, right? This kind of digital cut and paste collage of kind of years of research and inspiration by the artist. And another one is Luther Price, which is the kind of celluloid cut and paste version of taking found footage films. Those were often medical films, family, home movies, anything that could be found in a junkyard, really, in a thrift store, and cutting and pasting and making new narratives out of it. So just again to say how many different angles there are to look at any of these questions.
Yeah. I think both Arièle and Sarah's comments are quite poignant in thinking about how historically we have understood the artist as being a singular figure. And so often the figures around the artist have been left out. They've been erased from this history. And I think when we then return to more conceptual practices, even from the 60s and 70s, and I see a question here about exactly that time period, and we start to understand that the role even of the viewer has a relationship with the production of an artwork. These boundaries of, or these definitions, if you will, of who is the artist begins to kind of unravel in certain ways. And so from a more pragmatic point of view, in the museum, we've done a lot of work on trying to assert the teams of people that have contributed to not only the making of a work, but the production of a work, etc. So it's not necessarily a singular author, if we want to use that word, but often groups of people that have contributed to and made the work. So I'll look at I'll just talk very briefly about two works that I've always found very, very intriguing, two sets of artists that I found very intriguing. One is Vito Acconci. I brought him up in our first office hours. He is a conceptual, or was a conceptual artist. He worked in architecture quite a bit. But fundamentally, I think his practice revolved around ideas of space and what we understand as space and who occupies space. And so one of the works in our collection from 1969 is called Following Peace. And so the idea was that he would be walking through New York City streets, and he would follow people in the streets and then be recorded using photographs following people. But a more recent example, I would say, and I would say that kind of performativity of authorship is put into question by Acconci's work. But more recently, and a work that we showed in the reopening of the museum, was Dayanita Singh's Museum of Chance from 2013. And the Museum of Chance is a structure into which she has placed a large collection of images that she has brought together, she has edited, and it's a structure, a screen-like structure that then in her world, or in even our world, we can basically go in and rearrange all of these images to create new mini museums that would occupy the space of her museum. So it's a museum of chance into which we might imagine a collection of images of, say, a museum of tunnels or a museum of stage sets. And so all of the images that comprise her Museum of Chance, and there are multiple images in each of these frames, begins to be about choice. And it begins to be about how we, as a viewer, as an audience, begin to make our own collections and our own museums for ourselves. And that's how we then view, in a sense, her museum. So authorship is a really intriguing way to think about then the transformation of how we as an audience understand, participate, and in effect extend the life or the work of the art and the artist?
You know, it just occurred to me, since I have my two architecture and design colleagues, to point out a question that came in about artificial intelligence, which actually I'm just saying that like that, but in the idea that AI, in the future, AI could be, you know, be an author of artwork is certainly something that could be contemplated. But I would open that up so much more widely to say that a lot of the artists in the course, artists in MoMA's collection, artists working historically and now, have tried different versions of that in so many different ways. So for me, I'm a film person, you know, a film without a camera, you know, a film without film. I mean, the idea, there's one wonderful film in the collection, it's called Hollis Frampton's Information. It's also a good title. The idea that you can make information, make data, make an image without actually putting camera, you know, putting film in a camera and shooting a movie in a straightforward way. It's actually a film that's made from the electromagnetic movement of a light bulb, right? And it looks like it's this kind of abstract and geometric, perhaps something that an AI, you know, server could create now. So I just maybe I don't want to close this part of the discussion with yeah, like how do we think of AI of contemporary questions of authorship in relation to all this?
Absolutely. I think what, for me at least, I think we can keep that question in the back of our minds, because a question later that came through email, I believe, actually touches on the role of the digital and the conservation of the digital. And it proposes so it might be a nice kind of arc to, when we get to those questions, is to think about that. But absolutely, I think we're entering a world in which, or we're in a world now, I should say, where algorithms determine what we like and what we see on our screens, in as much as artificial intelligence is beginning to transform the ways that we work and who works. I can give you the example of you know, calling a company about a problem, and I had no idea that in fact I was talking to a robot the entire time. I had no idea, but it was a human voice. So we have a number of questions here around kind of temporality, questions of temporality, and about where we might locate the contemporary. Not only in terms of our course, but I think also more broadly. And I'll just, since I'm talking, I'll briefly say that Eliana Hidalgo and Leonard Steinbach have asked questions about if the course considers contemporary art starting in the 1980s, what would we consider the art of the 1960s and 70s? And then the kind of additional question is, in the future, or how far off, what will today's contemporary art be called? Is contemporary a moving target? So I think if we were talking about AI just now, the contemporary is a kind of slippery slope. I'll briefly address then the 60s and 70s question by saying that there has been a lot of literature and discourse around when we might begin a history of contemporary art. When does it happen? Is there some moment in the world that we could say, ah, we have left one era and we're entering a new era? And that will always slide and shift depending on who is speaking. I would say for our course, we began in the 1980s because there was a tremendous shift with the rise of the internet and computing technology. So that was a very long set of questions that we had. But absolutely, on the second floor at MoMA right now, we begin a history of our permanent collection of contemporary art in the late 1960s, early 1970s. But if I may, I don't want to take your time, Sophie and Arièle. I would just say that at any moment in art history, there has been a contemporary. It's been about contemporaneity, and it's been about contemporaneous, right? What is of the moment, or what is of the now? And I think this question of, say, 150 years from now, what is contemporary, is going to look very, very different.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like most art movements got their name from historians and after the fact. I mean, not all of them. Some people wanted to kind of give themselves a presence, maybe a lasting presence by naming kind of the movement that they were part of. But contemporary art is different in that way, that we are looking at it now and we are talking about it now, and the period kind of extends as the years go on, as Sean was saying. So that's definitely a question that comes up in art historical circles and museum circles as well, is, how will we look back? How will this period be named? It can't continue to be contemporary because contemporary is the present forever. So that's interesting.
We should remember that MoMA was founded as an institution collecting, archiving, sharing, exhibiting the art of our times. And that was true in 1939, and it's still true today. And actually, both of those comments kind of are a perfect segue into a question that I like very much that was sent in previously. That's maybe a question actually that you all ask yourselves. We certainly get asked it. And I'll say what it is in a moment, but I think it has an important actual historical significance. So the question from Krista Rigor is, how can you identify good from bad contemporary art? Is there such a thing as bad contemporary art? If you remember from last week, this is the kind of question that I love. So there's two layers to that. One of them is that technique and representation, right? The way something is made and what it looks like don't have to exist hand in hand, as maybe it did in traditional painting, in decades and centuries past. So I'm looking at the chat. There was, when we were talking about AI, Eliana asked about, is collecting images something like Gerhard Richter? That's a perfect example of something that's abstract in certain ways, has an abstract quality, but has a deeply skilled and deeply intricate process, right? And I would also invite you to look at the range of practices that are present in the course, in week 4 especially, the idea of making. What are you making? How? And what does it look like? There can be a gap between how intricately something is made, how complexly it's thought of and created, and what you see. So that's somehow my first reaction to that question. But we should remember 100 years ago that a lot of the painting that we now think of as masterpieces, masterworks, were thought of as bad paintings, right? I mean, I think the work that's on view, soon to be on view in our Félix Fénéon exhibition that you can see in our virtual views, shows how what we think of as, the kind of cutting edge of abstract painting, Impressionism, Pointillism, were completely radical in their time because they broke all the rules of what painting was, what painting was supposed to look like. So I think these kinds of questions are so meaty in a way. So the answer is no. There's no such thing as bad painting, I think. I think bad painting can be good, actually. We had a wonderful show a few years ago called The Forever Now Survey of Contemporary Painting. If you look at a painting, the line isn't straight, the canvas isn't where it's supposed to be in the room, the color clashes, there's a reason for that. And that bad painting, those bad choices, again, quote unquote, have something to say, and they can say something more than a good line, a good color, the correct color. So thinking of Fénéon, the artist in Fénéon, and thinking of the Forever Now, to me, they're sets of cousins, 80 years apart or 100 years apart. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like every contemporary artwork or every contemporary painting. You can still not care for it. But the idea that bad is good is one of those ideas that I like. So.
Yeah. I mean, I would say just to use a completely different time period, it's only in the last decade or so, I believe, that archaeologists have realized and conservationists have realized that, for instance, Roman sculpture was highly painted and highly chromatic and almost garishly so. And there were amazing exhibitions in Rome a number of years ago that basically took the white sculpture that we all say know and recognize and posed them next to how they believe, the conservationists and archaeologists believe they were actually seen when they were in the public eye. And what you realize is when you're looking at them is that beauty and goodness or badness, these aesthetics of taste, are very much driven by context, by time, by institutions even, and by individuals. And so I think this kind of around these ideas of what makes good or bad or what have you, art is really subject to kind of broader influences that then begin to define who as much as the what in terms of what we're seeing or who we're seeing, etc.
I also wanted to add, some of those qualifications like good or bad, or the idea that certain arts are better or worse than other arts, that has often been used by the people in charge who, art is not excluded from these kind of dynamics where for a long time, and still in a lot of cases today, most museum directors, most museum curators are men or white men. Kind of those categories sometimes have been used to exclude women makers, women artists, from being included kind of in the history of art and consequently also in museums. So they're those judgments of good and bad have kind of a wider implication about who is making that decision on good and bad. There's also those kinds of judgments are also made when you start, as I said, to create kind of a hierarchy of the arts. One famous example is the brilliant textile artist Annie Albers when she entered the Bauhaus, which was supposed to be this place where you could study architecture, you could study design. There were all these fantastic disciplines, and she was not allowed to go study architecture. She was kind of funneled to the weaving arts because it was considered that women, were naturally, I'm putting this in quotes, more attuned to that scale of design. And of course, she made brilliant weavings and textiles, and the world would be poorer if she hadn't gone in that direction. But to me, that question of good and bad, it also has these deep implications about who is making that judgment, who is being considered bad, and perhaps there are these deeper, perhaps systemic reasons for some kind of work to be considered bad work. And oftentimes those need to be reconsidered.
I just wanted to jump in because I'm seeing in the chat, and I think, again, using the word bad is a shortcut to say something that's not, that doesn't follow the technical rule in a way. Meaning, there's a question, well, if there's such thing as bad painting, then how do you choose what you put on the walls? That's a great question, and maybe we'll talk about the curatorial and conservation work later in the session. I would just say, make sure you all know, I think you do know how deeply we think about what work we present to our audiences, what work we bring into the collection, but to be able to think of technical mastery in one place and the strength of a voice and an idea in another place, I think is the idea. And sometimes those are the same, right? If you look, actually, Annie Albers certainly, and if you look at the entire wonderful exhibition about textile and design, taking a thread for a walk, you see how very, very often those things coincide. But the idea that they don't have to coincide, I think, is what's important and what's and what opens up the contemporary in a certain sense.
this idea also that perhaps you can't make a bad drawing. I mean, I think that idea of technical mastery that Sophie's referring to, that was used as a way also to exclude people from art making, or to feel like, you know, if they couldn't, you know, make a beautiful painting that looked exactly like what they were seeing in front of them, they could not be an artist. And I think the types of contemporary works that we've been talking about are very different, obviously, from that type of mastery. But, you know, one assignment that I remember, I'll always remember from art school, was being asked by my teacher intentionally, make a bad drawing. And then we brought these bad drawings to class and we were all comparing, and you know, they weren't bad. You know, the intent to make something bad, you just, as Sophie said, there is a lot more going on than the pure quality of a stroke or of a color. There's intention, there's meaning, there's context. All of that contributes to work. And I think, as we've mentioned, a lot of digital works, or a lot of works that happen kind of in different mediums than drawing or painting, for example. But that kind of technology has opened up who can become an artist, who can have access to materials to make work. And I think that's a very democratic and really wonderful moment that we're in.
Yeah. There is a question here that that came in through chat, that from Bhavita Bogaraju. My apologies if I've mispronounced your name. And I think to me, it surfaces, the question surfaces also in this question, these kind of aesthetic questions around good and bad. And they, on one hand, if we start talking about a good and bad, it kind of ends up in the judgmental sense. And I want to kind of move away from that for a moment, and just, Bhavita has asked, if an artist wants to communicate pain, grief, or violence, what are the ethics of inducing these emotions in the viewer? And this is a very, really profound kind of question, in a sense, because each of these emotions, pain, grief, violence, we can extend that ad infinitum across the world. There is, on one hand, there is an ethics around the communication of these ideas, because each person, each viewer, will have their own ideas, their own physical, emotional, personal response to these ideas. So that's one kind of field or arena in which to think about these things. But emotions, we can have emotional responses to artwork, or we don't have emotional responses to artwork. And I don't necessarily want to equivocate that if a work by an artist is communicating these emotions, or these physical emotions like pain, grief, or violence, that somehow these works exist separate from or in parallel to works that don't communicate these things. Fundamentally, pain, grief, and violence are part of the human condition. And if contemporary artists are responding to the human condition and asking questions that are both ethical, moral, juridical, etc., about the human condition, then we, as a museum, at least, and as curators, do have the opportunity to transform the ways in which viewers receive, understand, and are presented with these ideas. So I can think of the history of art fundamentally situated in pain, grief, and violence in many ways, at many scales. And so I think it's the museum's role, and the institution's role, and the curator's role to ask the questions as to how does this work, or how do these artists transform our knowledge, or transform the ways we think about the human. condition.
I wanted to add one thing to that wonderful, really nice reflection, Sean. The kind of two parts to, I think, the question, the way it was posed. We do think about what it means to present the idea of kind of violence or kind of graphic imagery. Yes, it's something that we have to think about. A wide public engaging with, what kind of reaction can that provoke in a wide range of audiences, young, old, different sensibilities. I mean, we do think of that spatially, physically in the galleries, but I would also invite you to think, or invite us all to think about work that elevates the grief, the pain, the suffering of groups whose voices haven't been heard, and just how urgently the work of artists can do that and does do that. So one of the earliest works in the course, in the first module, from television to internet, is a video by Tom Rubnitz and David Wojnarowicz. That wasn't finished in 1992. They were both had passed away from AIDS-related complications before the work was finished. And it's essentially a call to arms, an act of witnessing the ravages of the AIDS pandemic, and quite frankly, the complete lack of response from the U.S. government. So Wojnarowicz is, just like we are now, presenting himself in the television box as a news anchor, really conveying those emotions, and on top of that, anger and activism and witnessing. So that's the only document of, that kind of work is the only document of those emotions. Artists documented that at the time because society at large wasn't able to or didn't. So it's interesting, right? It's interesting to think about what does it mean to present something that's painful. But in this case, we can think of it as a witnessing, I think.
I like that word, witnessing, because it also sparks an idea around, say, how we understand photojournalism, for instance. How do we feel when we see these images? And what do these images of photojournalists working in conflict zones actually bring to the public eye? And I think it revolves around questions of what is true. And that's a very big philosophical set of questions that we don't have the time to ask. But I would, Arièle, did you want to contribute to the question?
No, I think your answers have really touched on a wide range of how we think, or how museums think about art that really brings up these kinds of emotions in the galleries. Maybe this is a good time to segue into a question that's asking us about the future, which was one that we were all excited to respond to. So this is a question from Hamideh Begar. Apologies for my pronunciation. So they ask, will contemporary art relate to art and science in the future? How will science be perhaps more integrated with art as technological advances continue? They say the way that artists use some programming or 3D printing or data mining, what does that have to do with contemporary art? So, there are so many works and ways that artists and designers and architects have used all those approaches that are named. I just wanted to talk about a few of my favorites. I think we mentioned her work in last week's office hours. Jenny Sabin is a wonderful architect who has always worked kind of at the intersections of working with biologists and scientists and 3D printing and robotics and weaving technology. She was the winner of Young Architects Program a few years ago, which is a competition that the Architecture and Design Department at MoMA runs in collaboration with MoMA PS1. And she created this wonderful textile installation that the textiles themselves were photoreactive, so they would change according to the sunlight, but also to the proximity and heat of the human body. So as you would get closer or touch them, they would also react to that. And that was developed in collaboration with scientists that Jenny Sabin has been working with for a long time. And in addition to that, they were woven robotically. So the weave itself was created kind of in this collaboration with robots, which is kind of one really exciting work. And Jenny continues to do really exciting work that crosses all those disciplines. One other work that I wanted to mention, which is in the course, it's a video that we recently added. Architects and designers Raul Sanfratello, who have been really experimenting with 3D printing. It's a wonderful video that we developed for this course. And you know, a lot of 3D printing when it first was developed was using plastic. As we know, plastic is kind of one of those materials that's very hard to recycle, that can be quite damaging for the planet. So what they decided to do is to kind of hack 3D printing machines so that they could print a whole other variety of materials. And they've been experimenting with a range of natural materials. In the video, you'll see them printing with ceramics, you'll see them printing with coffee grounds. They've done all kinds of experiments using kind of natural byproducts. And that's really, really exciting. I have kept the question about AI kind of in the back of my mind and remembered this wonderful work that will surely be on view in an upcoming exhibition at MoMA when we're able to reopen. There's a little bit of detail about the exhibition on our website, Broken Nature, from our wonderful colleagues in the design department, Paula Antonelli and Anna Burkhart. And this is a work called Anatomy of an AI by Kate Crawford and Vladan Joler. And this is a recent work from 2018, and they have followed the entire life cycle of an Amazon Echo. There's a website for this project. You can kind of go and poke around on there. But from the materials, the mining of the materials, to the technological feat of programming the machine, to its delivery into your home, they've kind of mapped this life cycle in a beautiful kind of digital sphere of influence. So yeah, we already have such exciting works, and I think as technology advances, as artists and designers get more bold in how to integrate that into their practices, we'll see some great stuff come out of that for sure.
And Arièle, we had another question about digital art that I'm going to read out. I'm afraid I don't have the name anymore of who sent it to us in advance. Maybe you can tell us in the chat if you're here. But the question was, oh, actually it was a two-part question. I do know who it is. Let's see. It was from Rosa Mercado Ceja. Question being, digital art has a replicable nature at its basis, but is infinitely reproducible in a way. Asking, is there such a thing as original and unique digital art? If so, where does that live? Where does that lie? That is such an important question, and one that the museum, for one, and the field, artists, curators, etc., have dealt with for years, actually from a different medium, which is, I would say, film and video. So if you think about the history of film, the history of video art, and that really evolves now into where we are in terms of media, digital art. Maybe after Sean or Arièle, you can talk about some of the things in the digital design collection. But going back to, let's say, the last 50 years, the way that film circulated was, there were completely different ways that film circulated in the world. So that means there were certain films, educational films or artist films, newsreels that were made accessible through wide distribution. You knew there was a catalog that you could write into and order a print, and you paid $20 and you could order it, you know, like you order anything else. There were certain works that existed really in much smaller networks, specialized networks, artist-run networks, that were almost exchanged like gifts or kind of within a real peer group. And then finally, there are films that were thought of as art objects that only exist in 5 editions, for instance. That's true for film, that's true for video. And MoMA certainly is an institution who has been part of that history. So I say these 3 different chapters in a way, these 2 different approaches, because the question of what's unique, what the original film is, what the original work is different in each case. How many exist, who can access them, and how easily or not can they circulate and be accessible. So it's interesting to know that the video department, actually, when I first started at MoMA, was housed under artist books, actually, before it became part of the film department. There's a wonderful new book from the founding video curator, Barbara London, called Video Art, the First 50 Years, who said that, recounts in the book that you would order videotapes like you ordered a magazine, and that has evolved so much if we look now at the way that so much media is circulated through the commercial art market. So all this to say that as we think about the history of art and artists, of the makers, it's also actually important, but I also find fascinating to think about the history of circulation, of distribution, how things were shared, who they were meant to be shared with, and how they were valued. And MoMA does really play a pretty important role in the history of that kind of film circulation. So if you're in video too, if you're interested, I would definitely recommend Barbara London's book. Maybe my colleagues can link to it in the chat.
I mean, I think that's so eloquent in a way to think about different ideas around collectivity and sharing, right? I mean, we hear about the so-called sharing economy now. Well, the sharing economy has always been around. It just wasn't branded as such. And this idea of like a social collective through and by which the dissemination and the understanding and making of work and artwork begins to transform. And so many of the questions that we've gotten today, and I'm looking at them, have dealt with time, have dealt with authorship and the who of artwork, which I find really fascinating. And just to continue, we have about 10 minutes left, I have to say, unfortunately, and we have many questions to still address. But there's a number of questions around technology and the role of technology. And it reminds me of a previous question around like the contemporary, right? So if we understand, say, modernism as having begun with the Industrial Revolution, if not earlier, in the late 18th century, when does the contemporary begin? And we might say, on one hand, that the contemporary has always been with us, right? It's always present, because as time goes, technology is always with us. And so this idea of a digital art, or even a net art, which is the kind of precursor to digital art, kind of again upends these questions of authorship and the who, right? And how we as viewers interact with, understand, and are implicated quite often by these technological forms. So the artist Annika Yi, who is in our collection, I think we also have a recipe by her on magazine right now. I have not made it yet, but it does look good. And also Paul Chan. Both of these artists are using technology and digital technology, in many cases, and material technologies to transform the ways in which we understand the substrate. Like what makes art, like what literally is making art right now, beyond the who, right? But what is it?
I jump in with a totally left field thought that came to me, but it's good. It's a good one, I promise. We had a few years ago, when they did, MoMA did the exhibition Cut to Swipe, really wonderful moving image show Stuart Comer did. We had an amazing program with Hito Sterol and Dara Birnbaum, kind of a video and media phenomenal women of different generations. Both of them, of course, engaging with a lot of the ideas that you're talking about, Sean. And at one point, Hito was saying, there's this notion that people keep talking about so widely about digital technological being ephemeral and being abstract and being immaterial, right? And she said, you can see, I never forget it. She said, there's nothing more tangible and material than the internet, because of the copper wires or whatever wires, I wish I knew more about wiring, the wires, the subterranean wires that are that allow us to be connected. And she's was saying, this anecdote of a rural woman who was digging out in the field and struck one of the wires and brought a whole country's internet down. I mean, just to remember how tangible, especially now, we can try to be reminded how tangible our immaterial life is.
Well, we're all precarious, right? I think what this moment in time has at least illuminated for me is how precarious not only our lives and our communities' lives and our nation's lives, etc., but the precarity of it all, and how, even if we have this amazing opportunity to communicate with all of you on Zoom, we all go back to our lives after this hour and continue to do them. And so the systems, or the ways in which our worlds are built and understood and are shared, are very much the same systems through and by which artists and architects and designers are responding and asking questions. And I want to, there are a number of questions just to follow up on technology, about how has Instagram affected, or does it transform the quality of the kinds of art that we see? This is a question from Himanshi Parmar. Similarly, a question by Kristen Castro about contemporary art and architecture in facades. I would say in both of these cases, right, these new technologies are transforming the ways in which we see, right? Not only in how we perform and how we communicate, but what is it that we see? And so much, I think, of the work of this course has been about trying to understand the ways in which both curators, museums, but also individuals translate what we're seeing. We're seeing so much. So then the artist's role begins to be about coalescing and bringing together all of these ideas, or singular questions and ideas about what it is that we see.
I would also jump in and say to that Instagram question, I mean, one wonderful thing that it has done for artists, and especially in this time, is, the ability to disseminate their work globally. That again is one of the great promises of the internet age, that we are all connected no matter where we are, if we have that internet connection. And so if you're starved for art right now, and you're probably already spending all this time on your phone, you can be looking at art as well. But I think it's been interesting to see also how, galleries, museums, artists are really quickly adapting. I've seen a number of kind of performance calls for performances that are streamed and created for the digital sphere, either Instagram or kind of YouTube streams or whatever else. Galleries calling for proposals for shows that can be disseminated and created really for the online sphere. I mean, that's not new, but I think especially now we're seeing even more kinds of those responses. Film festivals have gone online. You know, normally you'd have to be in the city, you'd have to go to the theater, and though we really do want that to come back. You know, for example, the Architecture and Design Film Festival has been streaming their films for a very low price. You can do that from your home while we're all staying home and being conscious of what's going on. So for me, it's not a quality question, it's an accessibility question, and it has been a really wonderful tool.
Yeah, I would say that the digital experience for time-based art, for all kinds of art, is something we're all discovering as we're making it. I think both as, you know, we're viewers, curators are viewers as much as anything else. The question of access is so major. You know, digital platforms make work of different kinds so much more accessible to a huge audience, but then you can also start to think about who has access to the internet to begin with. I actually saw an article I'll try to find and put in the forum about the environmental impact of digital streaming. That really gave me a head scratch. You know, think about, okay, we also have an impact even behind our computers. But all this to say, my view is that museums are going to stay digital after the pandemic, but we're also going to be still asking all the questions we've asked for decades about not only artwork and artists, but also cities and systems. And I just, you know, Sean has a wonderful show coming up, the Issues in Architecture series is such an important one. Think about what cities do we live in, how, why. I've been thinking about that a lot in my New York apartment. So galleries will stay important, the internet will stay important. We have to do both all the time.
All the time.
So unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap it up, but thank you so much to everyone who logged in for this office hour with us. It's been such a pleasure having you on the chat and getting your questions. We know we can't get to everything, but we hope that you have enjoyed this hour with us, and we will hopefully be doing it again. So watch your email for our next scheduled office hours. We also are thinking of different formats we can try out. So if you have suggestions for us for a theme you'd really like us to dig into, or some guests perhaps that we could have on, you know, we'll see what's possible, but it's been really wonderful to spend this hour with you. We encourage you to keep the conversation going on the course, in the forums, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.